Welcome back to Men and the City, and happy August to wherever you may be. In today's video, we're going to talk about war brides and sexless men. We're going to talk about the primal horde, part 2, if you will. Several weeks ago, I made a video about a revolt of sexless men against a system that no longer values them, that discards them, or at the very least ignores them and their plight. And that struck a nerve, and I'm not surprised that it did, because that is a festering problem not just in the United States, but across the Western world. And it is a problem upon which many men brood, and they brood, and they brood, and they brood, because they don't believe that there is any way out. They don't believe that there is any solution for them or for society in general. And so they have adopted this very fatalistic point of view that suggests that the last 10 to 20 years or 50 years, depending on how you want to look at it, of decline or decay or of disruption to the traditional gender norms or the archetypes that once defined men and women collectively, that they are so irreparably damaged that nothing good can come of the future, and so they give up. They tend to disengage, or they acquiesce. They simply give in to the nature of things and pick a hobby or a video game or a website, and they call it a life. And this is more common than most in the mainstream practically understand. It affects the economy, it affects our socioeconomic system, it affects our politics, and very soon it's going to completely transform the way our society functions, or rather doesn't function. But today I want to talk about how that system changes. Now, before we begin, I want to quote a chemist named Prigogine. Prigogine is a very interesting man who wrote about the dynamic between chaos and order. Now, many people, especially folks in the manosphere who are doom and gloom, are selling you a product. They're essentially selling you the idea that the world has changed fundamentally, which it has. There are new social norms. You have to acclimate to those norms, and you need to follow this 5 or 10-step process to do so. And at the end of it, if you're lucky, you will profit from this insight, from this red pilling, in ways that other people won't. But nonetheless, you will enjoy the decline that is Western civilization, or is the modern world, or whatever the case may be. Enjoy the decline. The error in that thinking is that the world is a closed system, that economies or political systems or socioeconomic systems or even intergender systems are closed loops. They are not. They are open systems. And what that means is that they are subject to variable change. And Prigogine understood that chaos does not necessarily beget more chaos, just as order does not necessarily beget more order. And this is self-evident. 50 years ago, even 20 years ago, even 5 years ago, you could make the case that we lived in a far more ordered society than we do today. And it's noticeable that we are increasingly living in a disorderly world, a disorderly society. However, disorder does not necessarily continue uninterrupted. It is also subject to variable change. And more often than not, order, and here I'm quoting Prigogine directly, order does not spring in spite of chaos or entropy. It arises because of entropy or because of chaos. In other words, the more dysfunction you get, the more there is a collective will in a system or in a human society that necessitates orderliness. Now, hang on to that idea for the moment. One of the mainstays in the manosphere is a man named Rolo Tomasi. And Rolo Tomasi I think is probably the most credible and the most authoritative writer, thinker, practitioner, whatever, in the manosphere today. Far more so, I would say, than a man like Jordan Peterson, who, for all of his accolades, academic and otherwise, and his mental acuity, he is to some degree out of touch with the plight that young men in particular are feeling. And to be fair to the man, how could he understand? He didn't really grow up. He didn't incubate in the world that we live in today. So he's out of touch. But in my judgment, Rolo Tomasi is in a much better condition to understand these dynamics. And in his first book, a book that I highly recommend and I'll link to below, called The Rational Male, he talks at length about changes, permutations, fundamental overhauls of intergender dynamics and how we need to acclimate to them. The most prominent methodology being the red pill itself. But there's a chapter in that book that is far more impactful and important than I think a lot of people properly understand. And that is a chapter called War Brides. And he wrote a series of essays, or maybe it was just one essay, I don't know. I'll link to it below. But in this chapter, he talks about the concept that at the end of the day, women in particular go with winners. They flock to whomever validates, whoever society validates, whoever society crowns as king. And this is more accurate, I think, than even Tomassi properly understood. And the reason I emphasize it is because there is an assumption, there is an assertion that female choice is fixed, that it's logical, that it is embedded in such a way in the female psyche that it is immovable. That is not the case at all. In fact, there is a bevy of research that demonstrates conclusively that female mating selection changes dramatically over the course of their life and is highly variable, highly subject to change on the basis of society itself. So in other words, what society values more often than not is the most important variable in shaping the way they select men. So in other words, if society changes or if the environment around a woman in particular changes, she will change. Now, he used the term war bride because war bride stems from our ancient past, even our recent past, in which you had females who would effectively defect from their social group when that social group was conquered or wiped out or what have you. In other words, when the tribe or the clan or the nation was conquered, they would essentially settle with the conqueror. And this is hardwired, this is embedded in the female psyche, and it helps them navigate through life because at the end of the day, their primary focus, as we all know, is to perpetuate. It's ultimately to procreate and survive. So they shouldn't be condemned for this mentality. It is simply a part of who they are. Just the same as men, our primary navigation is to fight, is to grow, is to conquer the world around us. That is not something we should cease and desist from doing because some feminist tells us not to. It is a part of who we are. It's hardwired into us. What's the point? The point is that as society changes, as vicissitudes occur, that female valuation of men is highly subject to change. It is variable. It is fluid. It is dynamic. In other words, it is a very permeable membrane. It is not fixed in place. It can change dramatically. Now, how does it change? How does such a thing occur? Well, many folks in the manosphere in particular assume that feminism in particular as an idea is unstoppable, that it's irreversible. This is not the case. And it's not the case because they think that feminism is an ideology, that it is a political structure. It is not. It is neither of those things. More than anything, it is a business model. And it is a business model that depends on largesse. It depends on prosperity, because prosperity is the bedrock for welfare. It's the bedrock for redistribution. It's the bedrock for runoff wealth that enables, whether it's single mothers or birth control services or affirmative action or any number of these programs that exist that are voted for in large numbers by women, it enables their operation. Without that prosperity, and by extension without that welfare structure, guess what? Feminism implodes. And it implodes for a very simple reason, right? At the end of the day, women need additional support. They can't possibly cover all their expenditures or pay for their children or their offspring themselves. This is a major reason why the welfare state is constructed as it is. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that welfare state is in trouble. In fact, I would go so far as to say that its death is imminent. And why is that? Well, in part it's because feminism has created a self-defeating social dynamic, right? It has encouraged women to go into the workforce. It has encouraged women to discard most men. It has encouraged women to, in many respects, operate against their own interest. And by doing so, it has discouraged men. So men are not as productive. Men are not as engaged, which means they're not generating revenue. It means they're not generating prosperity. The prosperity necessary to sustain the abundance of services that these women so desperately depend upon through the welfare state itself. We are on the precipice of major, spectacular change on this basis, and don't take my word for it. Societies around the world, whether it's the Chinese or the Japanese or the French in Europe and countless other countries, are beginning to come to terms with a standard of living that is falling, and falling quickly. This is the transition that I've spoken about on numerous occasions, the transition away from the age of prosperity, which is really the age of the feminine, and into the age of scarcity, the age of the masculine. All of the consequences of this misallocation of resources, of this uber dependency of a growing number of females on a shrinking number of men who are productive, it's finally coming to a head. This takes us back to Prigogine, who argued vociferously that chaos does not necessarily beget more chaos. In fact, chaos necessitates order. In other words, hardwired into the female psyche is this openness, this susceptibility to change on a dime. And that is precisely what they will do, because it will be in their interest to change their calculus. If they don't, they won't survive. So as the welfare state itself begins to give, as the prosperity that it depends upon shrinks, as the numbers of men that are productive and necessary to generate the revenue to support that welfare state, as they shrink in number, as their revenue shrivels to nothing, that's when the entire social structure collapses, and that will necessitate a rebalancing. It will necessitate a new orderliness, and that new orderliness will restore much of the intergender imbalances that we're experiencing today. Now, I'm not saying that this adjustment is going to be easy. It's going to be a painful adjustment, but an adjustment nonetheless it will be. Ladies and gentlemen, the primal horde is coming, and it will make good on the changes so desperately needed by both young men and women stuck in a system that doesn't work anymore, but a system that is highly subject to variable change because it is not a closed loop. In the coming weeks and months, I'm going to develop this theme, and I'm going to contextualize it more in an economic sense, but this plays a role in everything: geopolitics, economics, social dynamics, everything. And at its core are these male and female archetypes. So for those of you younger men that are wondering, what the hell am I supposed to do? Especially if my premise is accepted that things are changing, well, what am I supposed to do in the meantime? How am I supposed to adjust to these dynamics, to get through them? Well, you have a choice. You can go one of two ways. You can do what a lot of men have done over the last 10 to 20 years, and that is try to accommodate. Now, I'm not condemning men who do that, but I would suggest to most of you that that is ill-advised. Option two, which is to sharpen your understanding of these issues, which is to embrace the red pill or the truth of what's going on in our social dynamics more than anything else, that is what you should do. In other words, you should not be non-confrontational or shy away from asserting a lot of these dynamics in public or in your classroom or in an office environment or what have you. But you need to calibrate them effectively. Many folks in the manosphere are adamant, as an example, that it is impossible to red pill a woman. You can't do it because women are wired differently. Well, it is true, they are wired differently. But my pushback or my appeal to you is that you must red pill them. Because if you don't, you're accepting a kind of frame control that works against you and ultimately works against the woman that you're in partnership with as well. So in the meantime, what you must do is you must commit to the truth. You must consolidate around a lot of these principles that you know to be true. And don't accept or accommodate views that aren't the truth. Just sharpen your message. Calibrate it accordingly. Don't take a bulldozing approach, but be sharp in your message. Be precise in your understanding of these things. Because if you do, ultimately a woman will trust that you know what the hell you're talking about, and she will conform to your frame. One last thought on this is that frame is often discussed in the manosphere on a one-to-one basis, maintaining your frame with a woman, and that is a very important thing. But feminism essentially is a test. It is a challenge to our society at large. And so pushing back on that, which is precisely what the red pill represents, is a collective action problem. In other words, it is a requirement of all men to do this, or at least most men, or the strongest men to push back on it. And that is incumbent upon us. That is incumbent upon the vast majority of you who are watching this video on YouTube or any streaming platform that you happen to come upon it. So, Primal Horde and War Brides will reset the system. And that flush, that purge, that cleanse is imminent. It's coming. Every interest rate rise, every interest rate hike is yet another step in that direction. The direction of change is just as important as the change itself. Sense the broader direction of change. It's in our favor. It is not working against us. Chaos does not necessarily beget more chaos. More often than not, chaos necessitates orderliness, and that is precisely what we're going to get. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.